All right, well, I'm Stuart Brown. I manage the strategic planning branch at CPRA. We are responsible for the development of the coastal master plan. To follow up on what Therese mentioned about submitting comments with the comment cards, you can, of course, submit comments here at this meeting orally or through written comment, but you can also submit public comments via email to masterplan@la.gov. You can submit them online. There's a Google sheet that you can submit them in, and that QR code there will take you to that portal. You can also, if you want to, mail them to the address here on the screen, and we'll come back to this slide when we get to the end of the presentation. So this is not new information to you all, certainly in Houma less so than any of the other public meetings that we do around the coast, but Louisiana has been experiencing a land loss crisis for nearly a century. We've lost almost 2,000 square miles of coastal wetlands since 1932. There are many causes for this land loss. Some of these are natural processes we would expect to see in these sort of systems, but much of this loss is the result of, or at least exacerbated by, human activity. And so the land loss is, of course, significant from a landscape and a habitat perspective. It directly impacts the fisheries and wildlife resources, and it affects the folks who make their livings off of those resources. But land change also impacts industries like agriculture and navigation and oil and gas that rely on the coast for many of their operations. And as a result, it affects folks who make their living in those industries, which represents a huge part of the population here in coastal Louisiana. And of course, the way that many of our citizens experience this land loss crisis is that land loss also increases the flooding impacts of hurricanes and tropical storms that affect nearly all of our citizens. And the master plan is the guiding document for how we can meet these challenges. So what is the master plan? At its core, it is a prioritization effort. How can the state spend its money most cost effectively over the next 50 years to reduce storm surge-based flood risk and build and maintain coastal wetlands? Importantly, it is not a program or a funding source. These are the projects that we want to pursue as funding becomes available through a wide range of programs and funding sources. Some of those are things that Bryn will talk about a little bit in the annual plan report. So as money becomes available, projects move into feasibility studies, engineering design, and ultimately, again, funding, dependent on funding, to construction. And then we operate, maintain, and monitor those projects. And the things that we learn through that process feed back into how we evaluate project ideas for this plan, as well as how we end up designing and implementing these projects. The plan is developed through a process that ensures adaptive management. We're required by law to update this plan every 6 years. This gives us an opportunity to reevaluate some of the tools and processes that we use in developing the plan. It also allows us to incorporate the best available data and best available science, and we'll touch on a few examples of that in a few slides. The plan advances a comprehensive and integrated approach to restoration and risk reduction. It incorporates extensive public input and review. And this last bullet point is one that we really want to stress with this master plan, which is that it illustrates how the coast is going to change. It illustrates how people and communities may experience that changing coast and allow for preparation and adaptation into the future. So we know that the coast of 30 or 50 years from now is not going to look the same as the coast we have today, whether we're 100% successful at implementing the projects that we identify in this plan or not. And being able to share that information about how the coast is going to change, how people may experience that change, is a huge part of what we're trying to do with the master plan, because we know that the project of having a resilient coast is not just about the restoration and risk reduction projects that we build, though we think that's an important part of it. It's about many, many decisions being made by individuals, communities, local governments, all levels of government. And if we can inform those individuals and entities on what the future coast may look like, we can help them make the best decisions for themselves or the groups that they represent as well. So what is at stake are our homes, our jobs, and our culture. The goal is to have a resilient coast in which people can continue to live and work and take advantage of all the things that make coastal Louisiana so economically, ecologically, and culturally valuable. So where we are today, the plan was released on January 6th. The public comment period is open through March 25th. As we mentioned before, you can make comments here at the public hearing, but all the comments we receive here or by whatever avenue by March 31st will be reviewed, and we will be revising the plan based on many of these comments and presenting a revised plan to the CPRA board for approval on April 19th. And then following board approval, we will submit the plan to the legislature for their approval. So here I'm going to give a general overview of the process by which we identify and select projects to be included in the master plan. This figure is very busy, lots of small type and arrows. This is, I think, on page 5 of the plan. I think it's a great figure, but it's probably best seen on your own time. But the important part is the labels at the top: projects, modeling, and prioritization. We start with a suite of candidate projects. We model those projects to try to understand how they will perform, and then we prioritize the most effective suite of projects. So candidate projects, they come from a wide range of sources. We mine past plans for projects. We had multiple public solicitations. Anybody could submit a project. And for this plan, we developed regional work groups that helped develop new project ideas and also refine some of the project ideas that we've been kicking around for years. And so we take those projects and we model those projects. We use numerical models to understand how the landscape is going to change, how the changing landscape impacts storm surge, and how those changes in storm surge impact future damages. We then model these projects to understand how they perform over time under a range of future environmental conditions, and we compare these to a baseline in which we don't implement the projects that we call our future without action. So we're comparing a future with the project to a future in which we don't do anything. And the last step is prioritization, and we called our prioritization tool a planning tool. It's really an optimization equation. The models give us the project benefits. The planning tool helps us select the suite of projects that gives us the greatest impact in terms of building and maintaining coastal wetlands and reducing storm surge-based flood risk. We also develop metrics based on model outputs and community characteristics, such as demographic information or major industries, to give us a better understanding of how the changing coast and the projects being evaluated impact different communities and resources. In this section, I'm going to talk about some of the improvements for the 2017 plan, from the 2017 plan. So back to our diagram for a second, just to note that the starting point for this plan is previous master plans. So we are building off of the tools and data that were developed for the previous plans. We are also building off of a lot of the feedback we received through the 2017 process and early in the development of this master plan. But we're able to incorporate new understandings, better science, better data to make sure that we have as up-to-date of a plan as possible. So here we're going to step through some examples of areas where we're able to incorporate new or newly available data. This is not at all exhaustive. This slide here represents many, many thousands of man-hours of work, so I'll try to hit it as quickly as possible, but there's a lot more information on our website. One of the areas that we have a fairly significant improvement is in our storm suite. So this is a suite of synthetic tropical storms and hurricanes that we use to project current and future exposure to flooding. So this is developed by the Army Corps, and it's a significant improvement over the previous storm suite that we and they have used in the past. In short, it just gives us a greater ability to project existing and future storm surge. We also have improvements in the asset database that we use to estimate damage. So the storm surge models tell us how much flooding there will be. The risk models tell us what sort of damage that flooding will cause. And so there have just been significant advances in the availability of this sort of data over the last 5 or so years. We know a lot more about where structures are, the certain characteristics about the structures. One of those things is that we've worked with a partner at Purdue University, David Johnson, who developed an algorithm to estimate first floor elevations based on Google Street View imagery. And so this makes a big difference to have more refined estimates of first floor elevations when we're trying to estimate the amount of damage that a certain level of flooding will cause. Another set of improvements to our models, not just having new data, but having better understandings of the systems that we're modeling, is we can credit to the coastwide reference monitoring system that we have in Louisiana. We have nearly 400 stations across the coast where we're measuring all sorts of information on water levels, salinity, vegetation, the soil characteristics. And with this data, we can reassess, reevaluate some of the assumptions that we've made in the past, see whether the assumptions we've made in the past are really bearing out in this data set. And it's allowed us to refine our modeling in really important ways. Another set of significant advances has been in our understanding of environmental drivers. So when we're talking about environmental drivers, some of these include climate-related drivers like temperature and sea level rise, as well as things like subsidence, which of course is not tied to climate change. Despite these advancements, there remains a fair amount of uncertainty. Because of this known uncertainty, we take a scenario approach to better understand a range of potential future outcomes. So you'll see in the document, you'll see on some of the maps over here, we talk about a lower and a higher scenario. These are not meant to be precise predictions of what the future will look like. They're meant to help us understand a range of possible outcomes and test the projects that we're evaluating against that range of outcomes. And our goal is to select projects that are robust, that will be effective whether we realize a more severe future environmental condition or a more moderate future environmental condition. In addition to these improvements in incorporating best available science, we also made a lot of improvements to our process, and a lot of this is based on feedback we got from 2017. And one large piece of that feedback was we heard from a lot of folks that we needed to take a more local or more regional approach, that the problems of the Cheniere Plain are not the same as the problems of Terrebonne. The problems and the solutions in the Cheniere Plain are not those of Terrebonne and not those of the North Shore. And so one of the steps is developing regional work groups. As mentioned before, these regional work groups help with the development and refining project ideas to be considered for the master plan. These groups also served as a venue to talk about regional issues. And if you open the master plan, you'll see about a third of the master plan is devoted to these regional sections. And a lot of the storylines, what is important to these areas, what is unique about these areas, we tried to capture in those sections of the plan. Another process improvement is that we developed new risk metrics. So the way that we understand risk, we are defining by different metrics of risk. We typically used a dollar-based estimate of economic damages caused by storms. For this master plan, in addition to that type of metric, we developed a metric that is meant to better address questions of equity in our project selection process. This is called the expected annual structure damage metric, and you may have seen it if you've looked through the plan, or on the data viewer, we talk about this metric as well. I mentioned this one a little bit earlier, but in this, another process improvement is that we are trying to select projects across a range of potential future outcomes. So rather than pinning our plan to a single projection of what the future may look like, we're trying to select projects that will be effective across a wide range of potential future outcomes. And this last bullet point sits a little bit apart. We call it exploratory analysis. the previous improvements we talked about were about the project selection process. And as I mentioned up top, in addition to selecting this suite of projects, we really want to help illustrate what the changing coast may look like, how people may experience that changing coast. So we designed a number of analyses that kind of sit apart from that process, that we have kind of put little vignettes throughout the plan. We also have a lot more information that is available in appendices, where we try to, again, illustrate how the coast is going to change and how folks might experience this. One of the examples here is about high tide flooding. This is an example for Dulac, and so we selected communities that either currently experience high tide flooding, and by high tide flooding we're talking about flooding that's not associated with tropical storms or hurricanes, the sort of regular weather events combined with astronomical tides that can cause flooding. And so we look at key locations that either do currently experience high tide flooding, or we expect will experience high tide flooding in the future. Look at how frequently they currently experience it, how frequently they may experience it 25 years or 50 years from now, with continued sea level rise, with continued subsidence, with continued land loss, as a way to hopefully ground some of these projections we make that sometimes we talk about in these abstract ways. So this is another part of the plan that is, I think, a significant improvement from where we were in 2017. So the 2023 master plan, the plan is, again, a 50-year, $50 billion plan. We've allocated $25 billion for restoration projects and $25 billion for risk reduction projects. We selected 61 restoration projects, 12 structural risk reduction projects, and identified $11 billion for non-structural risk reduction. On the restoration side, we identified $2.7 billion in new diversions. We say new because in our process, in our modeling, we are making the assumption that the Mid-Barataria, the Mid-Breton diversions, as well as the river reintroduction into Maurepas Swamp, are on the landscape. We have identified funding. We expect these projects to be constructed, and we want to select future projects that will work synergistically with those, that will not have negative impacts to or in combination with those projects. We also identified over $19 billion, or $19 billion of the projects we identified are dredging projects. So dedicated dredging remains a huge part of our coastal program. It is currently, as Bryn will talk about in the annual plan, we expect it will continue to be into the future. And lastly, we identified $2.5 billion to set aside for what we call programmatic projects. And so these are projects that, for one reason or another, don't make sense to evaluate through our project selection process. Barrier Islands, for example, are the need on Barrier Islands is very much dependent on the most recent tropical storm. If we put a plan together today, a storm could come tomorrow, or not likely tomorrow, later this year, and we could end up having a plan that no longer addresses the need. And there are programs. The state has developed a Barrier Island program that can address Barrier Islands on a more responsive way. Similarly, some of these smaller scale projects, like small scale hydrologic restoration, oyster reefs, shoreline protection, are projects that are better evaluated through programs that can evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, like the Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection, and Restoration Act program, the Restore Parish Matching Program, the Partnership Fund, again, have the ability to evaluate these on a case-by-case basis. So, the master plan, under our lower scenario, 314 square miles of land is built or maintained that otherwise would have been lost at year 50. Under the higher scenario, that's 233 square miles, though we actually see a greater benefit at year 40, but that drops off as we go in the later decades, as some of the projects that we identify early on in the process and implement early on in our modeling are no longer able to keep up with sea level rise and subsidence in our high level, our higher scenario. So this is our projected landscape under the lower scenario at year 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50. The blues, of course, are land loss, and the greens are areas that are built or maintained. Under the higher scenario, you see at year 10, 20, 30, 40, and then at year 50, a lot of those projects are no longer able to keep up, and that's why we see that dip in that curve right there. On the risk reduction side, we identified 12 structural risk reduction projects for a cost of around $14 billion. We also identified $11.2 billion to be allocated towards non-structural risk reduction, that being elevating homes, flood-proofing businesses, and voluntary acquisition in areas that are exposed to very high levels of flooding. The $11.2 billion, that is to say, of the $25 billion that we allocated towards risk reduction, $11.2 billion of that is best spent on non-structural risk reduction in our analysis. And so with the structural projects and the restoration projects on the landscape, these are the 1% annual exceedance probability flood depths. And so you see that sharp difference on either side of some of the major levee features, with the reds and oranges on the outside and the greens and blues on the inside. And this is the difference of with and without the master plan. So with these projects on the landscape, we of course see significantly reduced flooding on the inside. We also do see induced flooding on the outside, as some of that storm surge will stack up against those features. And this is the difference in risk. And so it is, of course, correlates to the reduction in flood depths. We see the reduction of risk behind these levee features. And an interesting note is we also see reduction in risk around Lake Charles compared to a future without action. And this is the result of the restoration projects. There are not structural projects in that part of the coast in our plan, but we do see the impact of restoration projects, which is a good thing to see, something we expect to happen, but here we can show that visually. So compared to a future without action, fully implementing the plan could result in a 70% reduction in risk coastwide under the lower scenario and a 60% reduction under the higher environmental scenario, as measured in expected annual damage in dollars. The risk reduction as measured in expected annual structure damage is similar, 78% under the lower scenario, 65% under the higher scenario. So this is an annual reduction at year 50 of $10.8 billion under the lower scenario and $14.6 billion under the higher scenario, compared to a future without action. And this level of investment could mean that in 50 years under the lower environmental scenario, Louisiana has less flood risk from hurricanes and tropical storms than it does today. So that is the end of my presentation.